Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the Little Mermaid, as well as when it's right to perform what is called cultural appropriation. Now, for those of you living under a shell, it's recently been announced with, different reactions on different sides that the Little Mermaid will in fact be played by a black woman and be black in the upcoming film. Now, in the past, growing up, I had never really had a problem with characters changing race one way or another. I always thought that the best actor to portray the character should be selected regardless of race or potentially even gender in many cases. However, many stories rely to a certain degree on the fundamental characteristics of its cast. In the original Little Mermaid, for instance, the Little Mermaid is most likely white because it was being written by a bunch of white Europeans, it being one of the Hans Christian Andersen tales, which, like the Brothers Grimm, were written and compiled mostly out of the folklore of Europe, and thus consists of characters of mostly white people. Now, in The Little Mermaid, some could argue that, she's a fish, so we never knew her race to begin with. However, it is made clear in every version of the story that I've come across that she is widely accepted within the community as being normal outside of the fact that she can't speak or the fact that she appeared out of nowhere. And so it certainly puts a different tone on things if they are still in a European section and have a black Little Mermaid. Now, if this is the story of the Little Mermaid taking place on the shores of Africa and has a much different tone and feel throughout the movie, I'll be surprised and impressed, to say the least, from what I've seen of the casting. However, that I could see as being an interesting idea. But let's get to the problem with casting this particular character in a different light. Now, as anyone who watches my channel will know, I'm no fan of intersectionalism. I think that people should be treated equally as individuals, not be treated different based on the groups that they come from. I find it bigoted, racist, and sexist to believe otherwise, but a moderate percentage of the world community disagrees with me. So let's play by their rules for a second and talk about marginalized communities. These days, one of the lowest percentages that you can be as far as any of these groups go is gender. On a world scale, they make up about 2% of the population and are apparently a dying breed. Now, Ariel, from The Little Mermaid, has always been portrayed as a gender, fair-skinned and red-haired. This change wouldn't necessarily be so striking were it not for the fact that it is not the first of its kind recently in media. Mary Jane, another ginger, in this case from Spider-Man, for those of you who haven't been keeping up, has also been recently swapped to, I'm not quite sure, actually, the ethnicity of the new MJ. I just remember coming across an article talking about how she was no longer a ginger. Computing Forever is actually the one who did of the ones I've seen, probably the best breakdown on gingers being removed from media. He also brought up Guinevere from the BBC Merlin show, which is especially ridiculous because Guinevere not only has always been traditionally a fair-skinned redhead, but her name also literally means fair white. So having her, of all characters, replaced with a black character was kind of like when they did it with Elle in Death Note, except in that case I think that was supposed to be the gag. Regardless, in this case, while you can make all kinds of arguments about America or Europe, what we're doing on a world scale is we're taking a marginalized, underrepresented, even though they're only 2% character group, and we are erasing them from media and replacing them with a group who on a world scale is not only much more represented and much more present, but also growing rather than shrinking. So, Computing Forever asked several times why. Why is the media doing this? Why is the media erasing ginger people? And while it's part of a whole slew of characters who've been taken by intersectionalism as of late, I know that there's going to be a black woman playing 007, which, again, as that is a title passed down more than an actual person, doesn't really bother me so much as the fact that I suspect the reasons behind it are probably racist and sexist, and that will bleed over into the film, as it has with many other movies that we've seen recently. So, back to erasing gingers, the question once again is, why? Why is media erasing gingers? And one of the first things I do when trying to answer a complex question about the world is look at the money. Just follow the money, as they always say. And in this case, it actually makes perfect sense. Gingers are a minuscule demographic and a shrinking one, likely to die off within the next few generations, or, if we're not careful. Now, add on maybe, if we're generous, say 1% of people who fetishize redheads enough to watch a piece of media specifically for one in it, and we're left with about 3% of the population who might go see a movie because one of the main characters looks like them if it's a ginger. I won't bore you with the details, but needless to say, the percentage is much higher if you replace them with a black person. And, just changing the hair color to appeal to a greater degree of white people, well, that'll get you in trouble, because then you're removing a marginalized character and replacing them with a standard white one, which is worse than replacing one with another intersectional one, even if you are replacing them with a more represented group. So, what does this mean for black people? This representation is great for them, right? I mean, a lot of them seem to like it, and it just means that when they watch media, there's more of a chance that the hero is going to look like them. It's their time, right? That's what you'll hear if you walk around the streets of Portland for very long. Well, here's the problem. Black people have great characters and stories of their own in fiction, many of which are not brought through into the media, but take, for instance, oh God, what was his name? Dang it, I had meant to have it up. But he was the first black deputy west of the Mississippi and became a bounty hunter in the Old West. And his just record and his stories put those of Wyatt Earp to shame. Wyatt Earp, who was actually a fairly terrible person historically, but the same cannot be said of, I don't just want to refer to him as the Black Sheriff, but I cannot think of the man's name right now. Regardless, I started reading up on him and looked into it. There's never really been a movie, or at least not one in the mainstream, done detailing his history, despite the fact that he, in my opinion, has more interesting stories and shootouts than Wyatt Earp without having to go to the same stretches that the media industry has to make him look heroic and interesting throughout the years. So let's take some of these black heroes and give them their own movies. I mean, Marvel's already done fairly well with this, at least when it came to Black Panther, though I had my own problems with that movie. Probably for another time. I should do a video on how Black Panther was an attack on the African American community. But anyway, I think that when the movie industry takes an existing character and palette swaps them or changes their color for the sake of getting intersectional people to come see their movies, it is not just a blatant sellout, but it's really kind of disrespectful to the communities that they're drawing in. It's kind of like saying, hey, if we take this existing character and make them look like you'll come watch our movies, right? I mean, you don't actually care about the plot or the development. You're more interested in seeing a hero that looks like you, right? Growing up, I got made fun of because about as many of, and maybe more of my childhood heroes, both fictional and otherwise, were women as men, and probably more women, or at least the ones that when I was younger I spoke more about. And despite growing up in a place that was, well, very democratic and blue and far to the left, this was still something that I was made fun of for on a regular basis because it was just seen as out of the norm. But that's because I don't look at a character based on their base characteristics, on their gender, on their race. I look at them based on how good of a character they are, how good of a story that they're in. And when I see the media taking existing characters and intersectionalizing them basically just to draw in a few more people, it's just like when a company hangs up a rainbow flag on Pride Month. Well, there are a few customers who are going to come in because of that. A few people who, if you virtue signal the right way, will come see your movie, but is it worth the loss? I mean, especially if we're looking at this from the right's perspective, or at least, those of liberal moviegoers that I've talked to, they find that, oh, and I know I just said the right and liberal, but that's a video for another time as well. Anyway, most people I talk to who are on the side of keeping characters the same, I guess that would be a conservative traditional value. People who are of the Stan Lee philosophy on this. Stan Lee said that as long as he was alive, Spider-Man would always be straight and white, not because he had anything against people of other sections, just because that was how he'd been written and it was how he should remain. Those people feel, of course, that The Little Mermaid should stay the same for traditional reasons. I have looked at it logically and feel that if it's going to take place on a European shore, unless there are major changes being made to the story, it should probably be a more traditional Ariel. And intersectionals, if they are being intellectually honest and consistent with their rhetoric, should, even though many of them are praising this film, should also push it to the side, because it is really just attacking a different marginalized group at the benefit of one seen as marginalized. On a world scale, I don't think that this is really even an argument. Now, I'd meant to get into a couple of other topics here, but I think I'll leave it at that. The Little Mermaid isn't what's important here. It's the idea of characters being changed for arbitrary reasons, or basically just as an attempt to cash in on people's identities. Because I don't think that that's how we should be addressing anti-racism or whatever it's called. I think we should be putting up stories about real heroes of the race that they were. I mean, like the black sheriff I talked about earlier. I would absolutely love to see a movie about him, and I would be livid if they took this fictional black character and replaced him with a white man. So why was it okay when Hamilton did it with George Washington? Taking a slave owner and having him portrayed, ironically, as a black man? I don't know what the difference is here other than the color of people's skin. I don't think that with historical characters it should necessarily be done either way. But at the very least, the standards need to be the same. So if we're saying, as I grew up believing, that it's okay for an actor to play anyone, regardless of race or gender, just depending on how well the role suits them, then sure, that can extend to historical characters. But personally, I think there might be a line drawn where perhaps historical characters should be kept in the same race and gender, and fictional characters should be taken on a case-by-case basis. If it doesn't affect the story or any of the real characteristics, fine. I don't know whether or not this is true, but when it came out, I heard rumors that the play Rent had been written so that any of the characters could be played by anyone of any race or gender. I remember thinking, oh, well, that's cool. And then thinking, wouldn't that apply to any story? But as you look into it, the answer is somewhat no. Sometimes these characteristics, which we've grown accustomed to putting to the sideline as not important, which I don't believe are for the most part important in day-to-day life, were in the storytelling of the past. So there's a reason for some of these characters to remain what they traditionally always have been. But hey, this just came out as a rant. I was less prepared for this video than I'd like, but I need to get out a couple today if at all possible. So, thanks for listening. I know you humans need to be reminded to like and subscribe. So, if you'd like to, do that. But more importantly, leave a comment in the comments below and let me know what you think. Let me know what topics you'd like to hear from me in the future. And, well, as always, I'm your host, Cipher. Thanks for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club.